Welcome to Lead Story, everyone. I'm Ed Gordon. In his State of the Union address this week, President Clinton laid out his agenda to reform the health and welfare systems in this country and to curb violent crime. Joining us later in this show to discuss President Clinton's agenda is White House Senior Advisor George Stephanopoulos. But first, our lead story is the Nation of Islam leader Minister Louis Farrakhan's refusal to denounce anti-Semitic remarks made by one of his aides, jeopardizing his new relationship with mainstream black leadership. Joining us today to discuss the latest controversy are journalist Dwayne Wickham of the USA Today and Gannett News Service, George Curry of Emerge Magazine, and Joe Davidson of the Wall Street Journal. Gentlemen, let us do this first off. Let's see if we can give some very quick background. One of the aides with the Nation of Islam was at a college in, I think, New York, and suggested that the Pope, he called the Pope the no-good Pope, and that we ought to look under that robe and see what's going on. There was a suggestion of killing all of the white people in South Africa, and the anti-Semitic remarks about Jews and that they're running the country and plotting against African Americans, etc., etc. And most black leadership came out, denounced it as a racist statement, that it was wrong, etc., etc. People were looking for Farrakhan to do so. He said that this is part of the plot, that they are choosing to use those words to divide his house. Okay, let's take it from there.
First of all, this was a speech given 2 months ago, and it really took on a life of his own once it was a big ad placed in the New York Times. A lot of people have never even heard about this speech. I've read a transcript of the speech, about 62 pages long. It is vitriolic. It's anti-Semitic. He talks about Jews like dogs. He talks about some blacks like dogs. He calls Spike Lee Spook Lee. And on the South African thing, he said, he talked about Mandela in a denigrating way, and he said that if all the whites give them 24 hours to get out, if they're not out by then the no good whites should be killed and dig them up and kill them again because they didn't die hard enough. And if you don't have the nerves to dig them up, shoot through the grave. I mean, it was a very strong, racist, anti-Semitic speech. The question becomes, one of the questions is, I mean, by giving this speech, elevating this speech that a lot of people hadn't even heard of, and giving it so much prominence, do you do more harm then than you would have had you ignored it?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think the answer to the question is yes. When the ADL put the speech, excerpts from the speech in the New York Times on a full-page ad on Sunday, so it gets maximum exposure, what this did is it brings the speech to the attention of millions of people who otherwise wouldn't have known about it. And what's the advantage to that? I really can't see an advantage to that. I think it is important to attack racism, anti-Semitism, whenever it rears its head, but by putting these racist and anti-Semitic marks out for the public, I'm not sure that constitutes much of an attack on it.
I think there's a very clear advantage that was sought here. Listen, the Jewish community, the leadership of the Jewish community was quite uncomfortable when the Congressional Black Caucus and Jesse Jackson and others embraced Minister Farrakhan during last year's Congressional Black Caucus meeting. It set off alarm bells throughout the Jewish world. And in point of fact, when they found this speech, they saw it as an opportunity to drive a wedge between Minister Farrakhan and the black community. And having said that, I say that in a non-critical voice. The fact of the matter is, were we in a similar situation and had that opportunity to drive a wedge between David Duke and the governor of Louisiana, or David Duke and others within the white community, we would have sought it too. The question, it seems to me, that begs is, does Minister Farrakhan in fact embrace the rhetoric, the ugly, vitriolic rhetoric that we heard and that you have already spoken to?
Well, that's certainly the question that the Jewish groups raised.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that we would have done that with the David Duke speech. And had we, meaning the black community, done it, I'm not at all sure that would have been a smart thing to do. In fact, I think there's far better uses of our time than to put that kind of stuff out there had it been a David Duke
Should
remark.
we demand Minister Farrakhan denounce this speech and this leader? And to be honest, I think that the media has portrayed this person as a leader, and the Nation of Islam does not necessarily suggest that he is
not high power in Nation Kaleem Abdul-Muhammad. I've met him before when I covered Jesse Jackson campaign in '84. I met him several times. What's important here too is that Jesse Jackson has been trying to get back in the good graces of the Jewish community since the Hamilton remark. He saw this as an opportunity because, according to the New York Times, he volunteered to go in and say, "Let me denounce this speech." And I see nothing wrong with denouncing the speech itself. Now, Farrakhan, having been on the fire that he has been on, he is the last person on earth who's going to get up and tell one of his followers in public, you did something wrong. That's one, that's not his style. Two, the nation isn't figure we're like a closed community. I don't have to apologize to anybody or anything. If I do it, I'm going to do it behind the closed doors, which is the same thing he said to the Black Caucus. Let's go behind the closed doors. So to expect, if you know anything about Louis Farrakhan, expect him to go up and say that.
No, he didn't. Farrakhan didn't say that to the Black Caucus. In fact, the Black Caucus said that to Farrakhan said yes, and let's come out publicly and tell others not to try to run our lives.
He did make a comment about that. But the other question, though, is
that to Ben Chavis as well.
And the other question, too, is even when you have these kind of speeches that everybody totally disagree with, and I do think, we all say it, that we do have an obligation when someone major figure say something like this, we ought to denounce it and just not let it be a one-way street. But also the question is, and I think the dangerous part for black leaders is, whenever somebody, a Jewish, major mainstream Jewish organization say, you ought to denounce this, do you have to go do it? Is this the litmus test?
Yeah, let me get back to the point. Let me get back to the point that
principle.
the question that Joe raised about, what was the goal in all this. It seems to me if the objective is to get people simply to say, I don't agree with it, it does not require a public protestation of the speech. The objective, obviously, was to in fact, drive a wedge between Farrakhan and so-called legitimate civil rights organizations. I think that was from the Jewish perspective, that was a genuine objective.
And I think it's been accomplished to some degree.
And how much paternalism, as George is suggesting, is there when you realize that most of the people who have come out and denounced that certainly would stand by their history and say, of course I would denounce anything like that. Why do I have to publicly come out?
Well, I think they feel like they have to because of the recent history of black-Jewish relationships, where there was criticism of black leaders for not denouncing Farrakhan before. When Congressman Mfume, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, announced this renewed relationship with Farrakhan, that was basically his own decision. There were members of the caucus who didn't agree with that. And in fact, John Lewis said recently that was the chairman's decision. It wasn't on the vote of the caucus. So now they feel they need to come out and let it be known that the caucus as a body is not necessarily in favor of that particular relationship. I think one other important point that must be raised here is that at the end of the day, this discussion isn't going to really advance us on any of the crucial questions that we have to deal with. It's not going to advance us on health care, on crime issues, on welfare, housing. We're going to go around and talk about it, and all of these other problems will still be there, just to the same degree.
Thank you for the transition, because we'll talk about each and every one of those individual topics with George Stephanopoulos from the White House in just a moment. White House Senior Advisor George Stephanopoulos.
Lead Story is sponsored in part by Emerge Magazine. Call 1-800-633-0400 for subscription information.